Greetings, everybody. I'm Jeremiah.
That's him.
She's Vania.
That's me. Welcome to another episode of the Beard and Curls podcast, where we talk about dating, relationships, marriage, mental health, and so much more.
So what are we talking about today, love?
Today, we're going to be talking about systemic racism.
Trust me, you don't want to miss this. We're going to go all the way in. Cue that intro.
What's up, guys? It's your girl, Margot Bingham.
Karen Parsons.
You're now tuned in.
You're now tuned in.
You are now tuned in.
You are now tuned in
to Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls.
Beard and Curls. Keep it locked.
Our guest today is a professor, coach, advisor, speaker, writer, and researcher. She's passionate about seeing people and places better. She's a firm believer that collective social wellness depends greatly upon a deep understanding of purpose that takes us beyond ourselves.
You know her, you love her. Marla, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. We're glad to have you. All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into systemic racism. But before we do that, exactly. Before we do that, let's just get an understanding of what the word racism means exactly. Now, according to Webster's definition of racism, which is being challenged as we speak, racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Now, it also goes on to talk about prejudice and discrimination. So I guess the question I have for you is, how is systemic racism different from what I just shared right now?
So that's a really good question. And I think that given that the times that we're in, we have got to be very clear on definitions. And so the definition that is there that you just read to me, it's not, and it's not inaccurate, but it is insufficient and incomplete. And so if we're going to really understand racism in its totality, we can't just look at what happens on the one-on-one level. And that's actually what that definition that you just read, that's what that definition of racism actually more so focuses on. It's the interpersonal, it's what happens between people. But systemic racism is actually built on that belief. But what's built are institutions, policies, processes, procedure, culture, organizations. And so all of these, dynamics and parts of a system work together to uphold that very belief that race is the determining factor for who gets power, how people get power, who's entitled to things, who's not entitled to things. And so systemic racism is really about how do things like institution, cultures, processes, procedures, policies, how do all of those things work together to reinforce this racial hierarchy, which is ultimately about power? And we see that manifestation of that at the individual level. So racism occurs individually because we exist in a larger system that supports it.
Wow, no, that was thorough. I appreciate that. So I guess the question I want to follow that up with is, how do these systems even come into place? How do they come into power?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's basically philosophy. We have these philosophical foundations. And so I work in a political science department, and I teach Poli-Sci 101. And one of the first things that a Poli-Sci student learns coming into their first day or first week of class is the foundation of governments, the foundation of society is built on some kind of a philosophy. And a philosophy is really just a logic for how we think the world, and the people in it should be organized, should be governed, should be entitled to power, should not be entitled to power. So if you look at, even the system of slavery, right, it was first built upon a philosophy. This philosophy being that enslaved people who, were African at the time, who were brought over to the Americas and to other areas, that they were inherently inferior. Now, enslaved people were definitely secured because they were able to do extremely just rough labor. And so there was an economic gain. But in order for colonizers and Europeans to justify the trafficking of Africans to be that labor, it had to work and it had to be based on some kind of a philosophy. And so that guiding philosophy, if you look at the roots of it, one of the core roots you'll see is even a biblical definition or a biblical justification for slavery, which was the curse of Ham, approach, or the curse of Ham dogma or theology, I would say, whereby Africans were seen to be the cursed descendants of Ham. And so that was one way in which this institution of slavery was able to survive and to thrive. And so it wasn't just about economic gain, but for that economic gain to actually happen, there had to be some kind of justification outside of, financial gain for it to thrive.
Wow. No, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think this is such a good explanation. Like I was talking to Jeremiah earlier today, and I'm like, it's so hard for me to understand, like how people see that these people have the same feature. They have a head, they have arms, they have legs, they breathe the same,
Hmm.
and they still manage to believe that they're inferior. So that's like a really, really hard concept for me to process just because, yeah, I just don't.
Well, I think that once we take a deep dive into history and we really understand the foundations upon which our society has been built, not just ours, but other societies as well, you can really see a very strong, just philosophical, values based approach to understanding and interpreting the value of humans, even from a scientific perspective, the scientific institution, political institution. If you look at all of those areas, you will find people who we kind of celebrate as these intellectual and social giants, if you will, quote unquote, and they had some deep-seated racist problems, right? I mean, racism evolved to be, even racism even evolved to be justified by science, right? Because early scientists thought that Black folks were just subhuman. And so if you build your thoughts and beliefs on that, then everything that you do, whether it is building an institution, starting something or whatever it is, and then if that's what you think, then it's going to show up in those actions and like how you build and how you organize. And if you're someone in power, then you're going to wield that power in a way that supports that belief.
Wow. Well, now I think there was a book, if I'm not mistaken, you kind of shared that with us offline. Charles Mills, Racial Contract. Can you speak to that a little
Yes.
bit?
Yeah, so the Racial Contract by Charles Mills, it takes us into a deeper dive beyond what is typically known as the social contract. And so that's one of the things that I teach my political science students is that the foundations of government in this country, at least, it's based on this philosophy of the social contract, whereby there's an expectation between, two parties, citizens and government. So the social contract basically states, look, citizens, if you do X, Y, and Z, this is what you will get in return from us meaning government, right? If you're talking about applying the social contract in that kind of a way. But what Mills does is that he really analyzes how that has not been true for non-whites. And so one of my favorite quotes from that book is when he says, whiteness is not necessarily about color, but it's really a set of power relations. And so in the contract, you basically have, I mean, this is just a very high level summary, but according to Mills, the contract is, two parties, those who are white, those who are non-white. And so the white part of the party, they basically exercise power over non-whites. And so in a contract, typically you have two parties who have these equal contributions, and there's equal I would say receipt or receiving of reward or goods or things of that nature. But according to Mills, in the racial contract, non-whites are not really and don't really have that. They're actually objects of the other party. And so non-whites in this racial contract don't really have a say in terms of what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. At the end of the day, non-whites are perceived by whites to just have the resources. Anything that belongs to non-whites are basically open for whites to have. I can probably explain that in a better way, but I'm trying to make it like as simple as possible because It's a pretty good deep dive, but he basically like critiques this common social contract that we all typically tend to use to kind of understand how government is supposed to work. But again, the racial contract is kind of like that little asterisk at the bottom of the social contract, essentially.
So let me ask you. I have to ask this
Mhm.
though. So how
Yeah.
many people are aware of this racial contract? How many people know that it even exists?
So I would say if you take a basic, African American studies course, that's kind of like, reading 101. But if let's say that you didn't, have a chance to actually come across this book, I think that there's just an understanding, in non-Black communities that that is how it is, because we are hyper aware of how differently we're treated, and like what these kind of cultural expectations are. Even if whites may not be aware of it, we are definitely aware of it. Like we definitely see how we're treated differently, and so even if you don't know the specific term, racial contract, you definitely understand and can recognize the dynamics at play like in every day.
I understand. Okay. So then let me ask you this though. So how does systemic racism continue to
Mhm.
persist in implicit and explicit ways?
Well, because I would say we have not taken the time to really break that contract. um, so I'm doing a web series right now focused on my discipline, which is public administration, and in it, I'm specifically using the racial contract as a framework to ask ourselves, how can we improve public service, whether it's government organizations, nonprofits, social enterprise organizations? How can we improve those organizations so that they don't continue to uphold this contract. And so you can't heal what's not heard. That's a saying that I heard from someone. I heard that and like, it just kind of changed my life. And so what that means is that unless we call out things very specifically, which we have been doing for a long time, but the powers that be quite often like they just turn a deaf ear or turn a blind eye to it, because racism works for certain people. That's it. Like racism is a system that works for non people of color. And so if you know that, then you probably don't have any interest in breaking it, right? I mean, you have to have some kind of like moral compass or moral code that you operate by to say, you know what? My social, political, economic gain is not more important than really fostering a sense of humanity and really fostering a sense of wholeness and equity. And so until that happens, right, then we aren't going to have leaders who really, really push for, doing things differently.
Wow, no, that's deep. That's deep. So let me ask you this though. So San Bernardino County just declared racism a public health crisis. Now,
Yeah, they
how
did.
significant is that in the long scheme of things?
So I would say that is hugely significant. So if you look at the actual voting record, it was a 5-0 record, meaning that everybody on city council agreed that this is a public health crisis. And I remember when I posted the news about that, one of my colleagues who is in public health, that was just shocking for him, and another friend of mine who's a public health scholar let us know that there was this, it wasn't a petition, it was a letter by this, it was the California Pan Ethnic Health Network, and they were circulating a letter to Governor Newsom to make sure that the whole entire state of California it was declared in California to be a public health crisis. And so in that letter, you'll make reference to other cities and other states doing this as well. So you'll see that it's becoming more of a trend, just like at the local level. So, like, county and city. But I would say this is hugely significant because what we're saying here is that racism is not something from yesteryear. It's not something that we just study. It's not something that we just observe. It's something that is actually creating death, right? And death in many ways, not just physical, but death economically, politically, socially, educationally. And so when you have political leaders who actually say, look, this is not just about policing, and it's not just about just discrimination. This is about people's lives. To have that kind of leadership is really, really important. And what I hope that will do is that it will set a precedent to where we look at our structures, our processes, and policies, which with a much more nuanced and complicated lens, and not just do stuff just to do stuff, but we really try to change, like how institutions have been operating for so long.
Wow, that's deep.
So, what are some practical steps that can be taken to dismantle systemic racism?
I am glad you asked that because I actually, on a whim, I started this series. It's on Instagram right now, my Instagram page, and it's called Put a Ring on It, Not Treating Anti-Racism Like a Side Chick or a Mistress. And basically, it's very practical steps for leaders to take into account. How can they take this momentum that's been generated now over the past like month-ish, I would say, to really eradicate racism. How can they take that momentum and make it more meaningful? Because as a result of protests that we've seen corporate leaders, talk about how they have these renewed commitments and new commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, commitments to being anti-racist, commitments to donating money to a lot of causes, commitments to increase their hiring of people of color, and those things are great. But what's really important is to sustain this. So it's not enough just to throw money at something, right? It's not enough just to say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, but now it's time to walk that talk. And sometimes I think what can happen is we get so caught up with the fervor that we forget about actually putting one foot in front of the other and asking ourselves every single day with every action, how can this action or what is this decision going to mean towards getting my organization to be an anti-racist organization? And so, I chose that title because we've seen time and time again how these commitments or claims to commitments to equity and inclusion and diversity, they're very surface level, right? Like it's hot for a minute, and then you come back like 5 years later, and that organization could still be in the same place, right? And so, if we really want change, you can't treat committing to anti racism and practicing it in your leadership as just a task or a project, right? When we're in relationship with someone, when we're not, treating somebody like a mistress or a side chick, when we are in commitment to one another, we stay put, we stay in it, hopefully, right? The idea is not to be with someone, for a good time, but for a long time, right? And so that's the same kind of commitment that has to happen. And the other thing too, like when you're with someone in a really serious relationship, you are committed to the ups and the downs. You don't quit when it gets uncomfortable, right? You don't quit when that honeymoon period is over with. You are in covenant with them. You are saying, I will do what I have to do to make this work. And so that's why, like I chose that title. But the other thing too is that, put a ring on it, that's Beyonce, right? Clearly. And so oftentimes, and this has been a critique, is that people love Black culture, but they want the culture without the knowledge and recognition of the humanity and the pain. And so when we adopt these terms, right, when these kind of cultural catchy cultural things are appropriated, they're appropriated like for the fun, right? They're appropriated and they're used and they're saying like for a good time, but we have to get beyond that, right? There's a saying that people love Black culture, but they don't love Black people, right? And so this is a call to action to say, if you love things like Put a Ring on It, that song and all that, then love the people, who actually brought that to life, right? Love the people, who bring that forward. And so the series, again, it's called Put a Ring on It. It's on my Instagram page. And, one leadership tip, one of the latest, I think the next one that I'm going to be putting out, it says, it's for leaders who are really committed to anti-racism. Don't assume that just because you are, that everyone else in your organization is. Because especially if you're in a large organization, not everybody's going to be enthusiastic about this. right?
Exactly.
Not everyone is going to want to adopt policies and change their behaviors and look forward to a change in culture that's really going to drive home and hold people accountable for being anti-racist. And so for you as a leader, you might be all on board with that. But again, not everyone in your organization is going to be doing so. So you can't assume that just because you say it, it's going to get done. And so that means you have to make yourself accessible to people who are committed to this work, like at every single level, right? And so, especially if you're in a larger organization where you have layers of leadership, so you have a C suite, you have, directors, you have managers. And so the layers of leadership go down pretty far. And at every single layer, there's an opportunity for your messaging to get lost, to even like not even really get taken seriously. And so you have to make sure that those employees, no matter how far down the hierarchy that they are, that if they're committed to anti-racism like you are, that you make yourself accessible and available to them. Because again, like you have to keep the train going. You can't just, call out direction. So.
Mm-hmm. No, so true. So I wanted to share this quote by Angela Davis. It says, "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the difference between being non-racist versus anti-racist.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's a very important distinction because I think sometimes people believe that even if they may not be saying something racist, or even if they might not be doing something racist, then they're fine. They're all in the clear. However, that's not the case. So to be actively anti-racist is you are purposefully, you are intentionally pushing back against those things that keep racism going. So, like when you're silent, like that's a problem. That's why people say silence is violence, right? And so when you're being actively anti-racist, what you're doing is you're not just questioning systems that exist, but you are making changes, or you're trying to make changes to that system, right? So let's take voting, right? This is a voting year, for instance. So for you to be actively anti-racist means you are looking at the agendas of candidates and to see like what's their track record when it comes to policies that they have supported or introduced. Have those policies been racist or not, right? Look at what they're proposing to do. Look at what their political rhetoric is when it comes to identity. And so to be actively anti-racist is saying I'm going to not only choose a candidate who might be in line with my like kind of very personal beliefs on certain things, but I'm going to actively look to see who is practicing anti-racism and ensuring that equity is promoted and who is not. And for me, that's who I'm going to vote for, basically. And so you have to make some choices, right? Because and that's just the example of voting, right? Another thing could be, if you hear someone saying something that's racist, non-racism would be like, okay, I'm just gonna kind of ignore that, right? I'm not gonna agree with it, but I'm not gonna like say anything. But being anti-racist means that you say to that person, look, what you just said is not cool. It's not okay. So again, it's about more so being active to push against racism as opposed to just kind of letting it sit there and exist.
Mm-hmm. No, that's so important because it's easy to just be passive and be like, I'm not against it, but if you don't do
Mhm.
anything, that doesn't mean much. You're not changing anything.
Right,
So
exactly.
yeah, so I think I really appreciate your explanation. I think that's
Sure,
a huge difference.
sure.
So let's say somebody is excited and ready to start their
Mm-hmm.
anti-racist journey. Like,
Mm-hmm.
where should they start?
So number one, you definitely want to understand, and it depends on who you are, I would say. So if you are, let's say, a white person, who's kind of just now getting into this space, number one, understand what your privilege is in this space. It is one thing to only have to learn about racism. It's another thing to have to actually experience it. And so understand what that means. Definitely do not see this or view this as, like self improvement or a project, right? This is about pretty much, being open to a paradigm shift and how you view the world and how you treat people and how you want to actively dismantle a system that has defined, this country. And so that's number one. You always want to be in a space to check your privilege. You always want to not overstep your boundaries. Some people are cool with the term ally, some people are not. So I'm not going to really get into that. But, at the end of the day, you know, um, amplify people who have already been doing this work, right? Especially people of color who have been doing this work, and don't overstep them. Number one, right? You definitely have to be in a mode of learning and unlearning, and that might what you have to unlearn. It actually might push some buttons with you, right? You have to elevate your active listening skills. You have to, what's that saying? God gave us two ears and one mouth so we could listen twice as much as we talk, right?
Mhm.
So that's like the mind state that you have to be in, because if you are not checking yourself internally to seeing like, how am I activated? How am I navigating this, right? How am I, consuming information? Who do I get my information from, right? Then you can actually do more harm than good, right? And then as far as books, there's a ton out there now. Like there's a ton. I mean, you can't get on the internet and not find something related to this. And that's another part of the approach that you have to take with this, especially I think if you are a white person and you haven't really done this work before, is that part of the work is doing the work. It's literally going out there and finding resources, because resources have been out there for a long time. And that's one of the challenges. And I would say that's one of the frustrations, I would say, that people of color, Black folks have, is that, what we're talking about now, what's getting amplified and elevated now, is nothing new. This has been around for a long time. And so, and not just the inequity, but analysis and thoughts and perspectives and reports and information about the inequities, right? And things like the racial contract, that's been around for a long time. And so don't depend on or assume that people of color are going to do this work for you, right? So you have to go out there and do it yourself. And again, Brother Google is amazing. Sister Google is amazing. Okay. They can take you places above and beyond, right? But I will say this, Ibrahim X. Kendi has a great book on how to be anti-racist. So you can definitely, check that. I would say I will also give you another quick one is the Charleston syllabus, that was created and curated after the tragic events in South Carolina. Yeah, the church shooting. The church shooting that happened 5 years ago now, I believe. And so that's another great resource. So again, understand where you are, like mentally and emotionally and intellectually with all of this. Don't overstep your boundaries, right? Um, be more intent on listening as opposed to speaking, and definitely, do the work, the heavy lifting on your own. I'm not saying like don't ask questions, things like that, but even just be careful about how you do it, because for people of color who have been, again, like writing about these things, analyzing these things, studying these things for a long time, for us, it's not just an intellectual exercise, right? Like we're talking about ourselves, like we're talking about our lives. We're digging more into, and we're getting more connected and understanding more about what's happening in our families. Like so, these are the realities for us, and so it takes a lot. It's such an emotional taxation to to rehash these things and to write this stuff out, right? And to talk about it intellectually. And so you have to be careful about like how you engage people who actually do this work, and again, like study it, and all that for a reason.
Definitely.
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 Yeah.
So, one thing that I saw a lot on social media is young allies, they call themselves allies,
Mm-hmm.
that are very active about their
Mm-hmm.
anti racist journey, but they
Mm-hmm.
struggle a lot with their family members because
Right.
they don't understand. So,
Mm-hmm.
what message would you have for this specific group?
Keep doing what you're doing. Again, understand your position of privilege. It is one thing to have to convince someone, not to be racist, but it's another thing to actually have to endure racism, right? And I mean, this what I'm gonna say is kind of graphic, but I think that it can kind of crystallize my point. You know, um, this struggle that you may have and like kind of begging people to not be racist and begging your family members and really asking them to with all of your passion to see beyond color and to just practice being anti-racist, right? That pales in comparison to like the accounts that I've read about black folks being lynched and like begging for their lives, like not to be lynched, right?
Mm-hmm.
By a white mob.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say just keep things in perspective, right? And keep doing what you're doing, right? I mean, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
This is
Right.
a marathon. This is not a sprint. And so I've come to the conclusion because I do diversity, equity, inclusion work that you know what, I'm not for everybody, right? Everyone is not going to hear my message and be on board with it, right? Everyone's not going to listen to me and either like what I say or how I say it, how I look when I'm saying it or whatever, and that's fine, right? Because I'm not for everyone, and that can be tough when you're talking about family because that's your blood, right? But this is, and especially when you're younger, this is a crystallizing moment for your growth because now you're finding out that yeah, you know what? Yeah, some of your toughest critics are going to be your own blood.
Mm-hmm.
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 And it's an opportunity for you to really grow up and for you to be your own cheerleader. And when I say cheerleader, I mean to keep going, essentially, right? To not get discouraged to the point of inaction when you see family members who don't seem to get it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
my message for you is to just maintain perspective between trying to beg someone to like not be racist or trying to have these conversations as opposed to actually experiencing racism,
Right.
right?
Part of that is
Um,
also just,
mhm,
the family members maybe just didn't need to deal with their own fragility because we know that exists as well. There was a great
mhm,
book written about that a few years ago. So I think it's just a matter of people really understanding, like, okay, so this is what's going on with me, and I need to do the
mhm,
work. And it's not always
right.
going to be taught to me, like you said earlier. It's not we're not expected to do the work for other people. They have to kind of
Right.
be willing to take on that themselves.
Yeah, they have to be willing to take on it themselves. And, I think that in these times, and, this is what kind of feels different for me. Like one of my colleagues, told me the other day, she highlighted that she was much older than me and it proceeded to tell me that she remembers, like the Democratic National Convention and like the protests and the upheaval around that back in the 60s. And, she was around during these time frames, like these critical moments, like civil rights movement and things like that. And, like we've seen things happen between then and even now. But even she was like, something about this feels different. Like something about this feels different. And even though I wasn't around like in the 60s, I've been around enough to kind of see these spurts, right? And even, there's a difference between these spurts and now. And I think one of the different things is that you have more people across the board who are really starting to see the light. And there's more potential for white people, I think, to want to actually do better, to want to actually look at, where we're living and say this isn't right. Because like if you look back in the 60s with Dr. King, right before he was assassinated, he didn't necessarily have a high approval rating. Like I mean, we celebrate him today, but he was considered to be like a disruptor and not in a good way. Not by everybody, right? And so, like I think that now, um, I mean, there are definitely still people today who are just hardline racist. They may not ever change, right? But I think my hope is that there are more people who are willing to change than who are not willing to change.
Hmm.
And so for every like one family member who is going to dig their heels in and double down on their racist ideology, I'm hopeful that there are like two other people or three other people who are saying, I want to do better.
Exactly. And like you said,
Mm-hmm.
we're at a different time right now than anything
Hmm.
I can remember as well. So it'll be interesting to see how much further we can go with this because I really feel like this is critical. And I
Yeah.
think, a lot of people are more tuned in to what's going on. So again,
Mm-hmm.
you drop some, not just gems, you drop bombs. So I mean nukes, and so I'm excited, and so and a lot of the stuff you shared as far as like the readings and the materials, we'll make sure to include those in the show
Okay.
notes, so that way
Mm-hmm.
people can definitely go check that out for themselves. But yeah,
Yeah.
definitely much needed conversation. So I really love your insights and everything that you shared on that. So I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit. Now you're
Hmm.
also involved with a spiritual wellness platform called Haloloop. Can you share a little bit
Yes.
more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited because Haloloop is a brand new tech spiritual wellness platform that has life coaching, therapy, spiritual counseling, and other kinds of inspirational content all in one place, which is really different than what people are typically used to. Because typically, if you want to, go to therapy, you find therapy, but then you have to go somewhere else to find counseling, gotta go somewhere else to do yoga, gotta go somewhere else to get coaching. But the beauty of Halo Loop is that we help you to create this loop, essentially a community that can support you, not just when you are in bad times, right? But for us, spiritual wellness is not just about intervention, but it's also preventative. And so, even if you're not, dealing with depression or anxiety or anything like that, like think of it as going to get a tune-up or like a checkup on your car. Your car can be running perfectly fine, but every now and then you do want to go in just to make sure that everything is good. And, we give you that opportunity for growth as well. And so we're having a deal right now where if you sign up, I think the last day might be July, mid July, around there. You get 30 days free of this great service. And so we have an array of providers, who are experienced, they are credentialed, and they will take you through individual appointments or group experiences where you and peers who are also, going through some similar stuff or wanting to grow in similar ways as you are, you guys go through it together. And we also give you your own Loop advisor. And so this is a really special feature of Halo Loop because your Loop advisor is another added layer. So we don't just leave you out there on your own to just choose stuff, but the Loop advisor, who is a trained social worker as well, is able to really get to know you and to point you in the right direction. But they're also available for wellness chats too. And so, yeah, that's pretty much Halo Loop. And we also have a YouTube channel, and it's just called Halo Loop. You can find it on YouTube. And we have, gosh, like several videos now by some great meditation instructors and some just inspirational people. So we have meditations on there, different kinds of meditations too. Reiki is on there as well. There's someone who does cord cutting too. So yeah, I mean, we try to just keep you covered. And again, if you pursue it now, go to haloloop.com. Then I think until July, mid July ish, you can get 30 days free on us.
Wow, no, that's powerful. I like that because it's like a
Mm-hmm.
comprehensive one-stop shop approach where you can literally come in there and get several needs met. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've seen anything
Yeah.
like that, in the
Yeah,
time that I've been involved.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we
I like
cover
that.
everything. So, navigating depression, anxiety, understanding your spiritual beliefs and identity, dating, career advice, setting life goals. So it's really diverse. So there's something there for everybody.
Definitely, and I encourage everybody listening to definitely go check that out.
Thank
And
you.
so,
Yeah.
and now I want to also ask you about your own project that you're starting up called Sounding Board Solutions. Can you tell us?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So I've kind of done a soft launch, if you will, but I'm trying to do something a little bit bigger in the next couple of weeks. And so Sounding Board Solutions is just like my leap of faith to kind of take my own kind of natural talents and what I've been doing for the past several years and formalizing it into a consulting company. So Sounding Board Solutions, all of it is basically it's your strategic thought partner to help you grow, scale, and to make impact essentially. And so right now I'm offering services related to chief of staff advising, research, and evaluation. And so for chief of staff, I'm actually the chief of staff at Halo Loop. And so for my services through Sounding Board, what what I do is that I help people to understand what their chief of staff needs actually are, how to secure and identify the right person. But even for people who are maybe at the beginning of their chief of staff career, I provide mentorship and some advice for how to really be the best chief of staff you can be, and to elevate not only your professional career, but really contribute even more and more to the company that you're at. Because typically we think of chief of staff, and immediately what comes to mind is a political office or campaign. But there are more and more companies now, private sector companies and startups, who really see the value of a chief of staff. And because that person can really help leaders in that company, kind of help them to, I would say, make sure that the direction that they're going in is really one that is strategic, but also help them not forget about the details as well. And so, yeah, that's the core function of what I do with Sounding Board Solutions for Chief of Staff. And then advisory services, that's a little bit less intense. And so people just literally need a sounding board, right? Like, I have this idea. I'm not sure if it's going to work. What should I be doing or thinking about? I'm that person, so I kind of walk you through a kind of guided decision-making process. And it's really, again, a lot having to do with personal growth, but a lot of it having to do with business and professional changes as well. So I'll give you an example of a client that I have now. And she's looking to do some changes, in her organization and to promote better diversity, equity, inclusion. And so, she comes to me, we talk, and I kind of coach her through some questions to consider, some alternative methods and approaches. And, she's doing those things right now. And I find resources for her as well to support what she's doing and just to take a deeper dive into information and research. So, yeah.
Wow. And just from the time that we've gotten to know you, I would say that to anybody listening, Marla is worth every penny.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're funny. Every penny. Yes. Every
Thank
single
you.
penny.
Thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate
welcome.
that. Thank you. Thank you.
So Marla, where can someone find you online?
So my Instagram handle is right there on the screen, at It's Just Marla. And if you go there, you can, see what I've been talking about. I've been talking a lot about anti-racism, and you can also go to my profile link in my bio, and you can find my LinkedIn profile. And if you go to my LinkedIn profile, that'll show you more about like my body of work. So papers that I've written, that I published, and other things as well. And so, yeah, and the Instagram page is where you can also find the Put a Ring on It series. I'm kind of organizing that, but so for right now, it's kind of distributed all throughout my account. But I am working on just kind of consolidating it into one space that you can see. So, yeah.
Okay.
Wow. Powerful. Well, Marla, it's definitely truly been a pleasure. We're so glad to have had you on and sharing
Thank
everything that you brought to the show, and continued success on everything that you're going to get ready to do going forward.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And thank you for reaching out to me. I love what you guys are doing. I love your energy, and hopefully I can be back on again.
Yeah.
Definitely. Maybe next time in person. Who knows?
Absolutely. Because we're right in each other's backyard. We might as well. So
Exactly. All
Definitely.
right.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Marla.
Marla.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's our show for today.
Thanks again for tuning in.
And as always, like it or not, Beard and Curls is the new his and hers.